Hi, everybody. So we're going to start here, jump right in, and begin with an introductory discussion of, well, first, philosophy in general, and then we'll move into an introduction of moral and ethical philosophy, which is the focus of our class. Just what is it? What does it cover? And just get our bearings to begin with. So, what's philosophy? The word philosophy comes from the ancient Greek, and it is philia, which means love, plus sophia, which is wisdom. And so etymologically together, it means love of wisdom. And the Greeks had at least like 7 different words to describe different senses of love, right? Love's not one thing. You can love all different kinds of things in all different kinds of ways. So the Greeks practiced using different words to capture more succinctly what they meant when they said the word love. Some of these were eros, it's like erotic love, right? Sensual love, sexual love. There was storge, which is like family love, the kind of family bonds you feel. Agape, which is an unconditional, generalized, all-encompassing sort of love. And then there is philia, which meant an attraction to or an affinity for, not in a sexual sense, but more of a deep interest in, right? So, you dig it is a philia. So philia plus sophia is kind of like digging wisdom, really being into wisdom and its acquisition, right? And there's a few different typically philosophy is divided into 3 large branches. And we'll take a quick look at what each of those branches are. And again, this is just to get your bearings, since this is an introductory course on philosophy. First, there's metaphysics. And metaphysics covers theories of reality and the ultimate nature of all things. Its aim is to provide a comprehensive view of the universe, like a worldview. And some of the questions include, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all, for instance? Is time real or is it an illusion? Same for space. Same for causation or causality. What is human consciousness? Like, is it a material phenomenon or is it an immaterial phenomenon? Do human beings have souls? And if not, what accounts for our sense of personal identity over time? Do we have free will? Or are all of our actions determined and free will is just an illusion? Again, does God exist? This is just a really small sample of some metaphysical questions in philosophy. So that's one major branch of philosophy. Another is epistemology. And epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge, and that includes the nature of knowledge, the scope of knowledge, the limits of knowledge. As opposed to psychology, this is a philosophical inquiry of knowledge. Some of those questions include, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for having knowledge? What's a working definition that we can use and to pin down the concept when we talk about knowledge? What's it possible to know? What's impossible to know? By extension, how precisely do we come about knowledge? Do we come about it from the ground up, or is it a top-down phenomenon? What exactly do we mean by truth? Can we know anything at all with any degree of certainty? Those are all, that, again, just a real small sample of epistemological questions, which is the second main branch of philosophy. And then there's what's known as axiology. This picture got bungled here. It was supposed to be, you're supposed to see a statue and, the scales of justice in here. Just use your imagination. I messed that one up. But axiology is the third major branch of philosophy, and that is the study of value and the distinction between value and fact. And there's two main subdivisions of axiology, and that's ethics and aesthetics. So actually, let's take aesthetics first. So aesthetics is a study of sensual experience, like the nature of art and the experiences we have when we enjoy the arts or take pleasure in nature, for instance. The questions include what makes something beautiful, what makes something ugly. Is beauty subjective or objective? Is it in the eye of the beholder, or is it a quality that you can quantify? Is it something you can measure out in the world? What's the difference between art and mere expression? Is there one? Just a sampling of aesthetics, which is a subdivision of axiology. And then now let's go back and pick up ethics. Ethics is the study of good and bad, right and wrong. It's the search for the good life and the defense of the principles and rules of morality. And some of the questions include, what is the greatest good for humankind? Or what's the greatest good for living things? How can I know right from wrong? Do right and wrong exist objectively, or are they subjective phenomenon again? How ought I live? To add to this list, is there any such thing as real duty or obligation? And under what conditions should I be held to my duties or obligations? And you can kind of see, if you just push that thinking a little bit further, political theory springs from ethical theory. So the idea is this: once you have established, hey, this is what's good, this is what's bad, here's what's right, here's what's wrong, under these certain conditions, and all of these behaviors are undertaken in order to achieve this greatest good, then you can develop a political theory that aims to realize these features in the world. All of these being arguments, of course. In other words, theories. Now, Stanley Milgram, many of you, you may have heard of him before, and his obedience experiments. He was an American social psychologist, and he did a series of experiments using simulated electric shocks, and I'll post a video about him. But this is a good place to kick off the course. A quote from him: "Ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority." And what I want to point out here is that when Milgram says relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority, he's not referring to money and power. Well, he's not referring to money and, let's say, social power. He's referring to personal, intellectual resources. Resources that you, conceptual resources, ways of breaking down certain moral claims that other people make and the authority that other people seem to hold over you when they make these claims. What he's saying is that many people don't have, they kind of freeze and do what they're told. And part of the purpose of this course is to gather some of those resources, because it's my opinion that by studying these different arguments about the nature of right, wrong, good, bad, what ought I do and not do, and under what conditions, and examining the complex arguments on behalf of any of those notions, you gather the resources you need to resist authority. So let's take a look at just morality and ethics. Right, those words are kicked around interchangeably quite often, and in many ways they can be and should be. There's nothing wrong with just on the street using, I don't believe, the word moral and ethical interchangeably. But let's try to get a little distinction going. What do the words even mean? What's the difference between them once we have that down? And then also let's move to what purpose does morality serve? Why be moral, or why try to be a good person or avoid being a bad person? To what end? What's the point? So the etymology. So the word ethics is from the Greek word ethos, and that meant habitual action, or like a disposition to behave in a certain way. So you look, if you were looking at somebody's, let's imagine that somebody just every time they came up upon garbage in the street, they picked it up. Every time, boom, boom, it was a habit to them. You'd say they had a certain ethos about that. They've made a habit of doing this certain action because they think it is a way they ought to behave. That's their ethos, right? And it's reflected in their habits. Morality, on the other hand, comes from the Latin word moralis, and that means custom or conduct. So it becomes a little bit more loaded, if you will, at this point, where ethos simply meant your habitual action. Moralis kind of starts to already pack into it a notion of the good, or more so than ethos did. Let's put it that way. And strictly speaking, the word morality is used to refer to what we would call moral standards and moral conduct, while ethics is used to refer to the formal study of those standards and conduct. And also, the study of ethics is often called moral philosophy, just to add to the confusion. But this is a good working separation here, right? Morality refers to moral standards and moral conduct, and maybe even has a personal element, where ethics is the study of those and has a more public element. And that's a good working distinction. And there are a few different approaches to moral philosophy or ethics. And the first one is known as descriptive ethics, and that's the study of people's beliefs about morality. So descriptive ethics, it describes particular sets of morals and codes of conduct that individuals or groups practice, right? What is the case? What do people think is right or wrong? So you're not making any judgments about it. It's a strictly descriptive account of people's or groups' moral beliefs. So that's one approach to moral philosophy. It's called descriptive ethics. Then there's prescriptive ethics, and that's the study of ethical theories that prescribe or dictate how you ought to act. Like, what ought people do? So notice the difference. This is just saying, hey, group X behaves like this and thinks this is right and this is wrong. Group Y behaves like that and thinks this is right and this is wrong. That would be descriptive. If you're actually crafting arguments that say, you ought to, or human beings ought to behave in this manner because of this reason, that reason, and the other, then you're offering a prescriptive account. A prescriptive ethical account. You're doing prescriptive ethics by doing that. You're just like a doctor would write you a prescription, right? They're telling you, you ought to take this, and then handing you that piece of paper that says that. That's what prescriptive ethics are doing. You ought to behave like this, or you ought not behave like that. So really what we have here is an is and an ought distinction between those two different approaches. Then there's applied ethics, and that's essentially, how do you take these theories, these prescriptive theories, and put them into practice? So this is theoretical, and then there's a lot of different theories, and that's what half the course is about, studying these theories. But then you gather these theories and put them into action, put them into the practical life world. And so some familiar types of applied ethics for you, maybe bioethics is familiar. That's ethical theory applied to the medical industry or biological subjects. There is environmental ethics. That's these theories applied to environmental issues. There's business ethics, same deal. So applied ethics take these carefully formulated ethical theories and apply them to everyday dilemmas. So the second half of the course, we'll be doing applied ethics. First half, we'll be looking at kind of both of these. And then there's meta-ethics, and meta-ethics kind of tries to go underneath, or let's put it, or beyond ethics, and ask, what do these things even mean in the first place? Where did these terms even come from? Why do we even have them? Right? We don't really do this in this course, but if you're interested in that, maybe some Nietzsche. So now, just on an intuitive level, we could ask ourselves, what's the purpose? And it's really a hard question to get underneath, but we have to. Why be moral? Why have a moral code at all? Why try to be a good person, or not to be a bad one at minimum? And also, why hold other people to those standards? And why do we, what drives this? To what end is really the question. And that can be answered in myriad ways. So for some, the primary purpose of morality is to please God. If you're a religious person, then this is the answer to why you should be moral is pretty simple. It's to please God, or to live in accordance with God's will, right? That's why you behave a certain way and refrain from behaving in others. But what if you're not a religious person? Does that exclude you from the realm of morality? No. So there are a host of other secular moral theories that we'll study. We'll study a few of these religion-based moral theories. But then there's a host of secular or non-religious moral theories that we're going to study as well. And some of them will include the following. Or another question would be, is the primary purpose of morality to promote our self-interest? Is that why you behave in a certain way? Is it to promote the interest of others? Is it to maximize pleasure and happiness amongst all humans and or sentient creatures in the world? Is that the reason that we act or ought to act in a certain way? Is it to maintain and promote our rational faculties? Does moral action or a moral code have something to do with our capacity to reason? And that's why we need to be moral. Is it to safeguard our rights and allow for civilized living amongst one another? Is that why we should behave in certain ways and refrain from behaving in others? Is it to promote the flourishing of human life and human capacities and to move away from everything that doesn't? Is that the reason for morality, or why we should be moral at all? Or is it to dampen our individual power and creativity, making us easier to control? Some people think that as well. So if this is your answer, there are religion-based moral theories. Obviously, morals or ethics is part of just about every religion, right? An essential part. But we'll take a look at a couple of the religious theories. If you think it's to promote our self-interest, you'd be known as an ethical egoist. If you think it's to promote the interest of others, you'd be known as an altruist. If you think it's to maximize pleasure and happiness, you'd be known as a utilitarian. If you think it's to maintain and promote our rational faculties and keep our intentions in check, you'd be known as a deontologist. If you think it's to safeguard our rights and allow for civilized living, you'd be known as a social contract theorist. If you think it's to promote the flourishing of human life and human potential, you'd be known as a virtue ethicist. And if you think that morality simply exists to dampen our individual power and creativity, making us easier to control, I'm not sure what you'd call that, but many people believe that. I don't know, again, I'll post an essay that you might find interesting if you're interested in this one. Now, let's do a quick bit of, it's not really logic, but it's statement analysis. So there are all different sorts of sentences in language, right? But a statement specifically, it's also known as a proposition, right? And a statement is a sentence with a truth value. And what that means is not that it's true, it simply means that it makes sense if to answer true or false to it. So if, for instance, I said, it is raining outside, right now that could be true or false. Correct? So that has a truth value. If I said there is a leprechaun-headed unicorn in the corner painting my fire alarm, that too has a truth value. It just happens to be false. So when we say statements in philosophy, that's what you mean. Like, as opposed to other sorts of statements like, hey, let's go grab a burrito. You can't say true or false to that. Or, hey man, where did you get those cowboy boots? You can't say true or false to that. So claims are statements. So two types of statements not the only two types, but there's two types, are scientific and moral. So an example of some scientific statements, real simple ones. The Earth rotates around the sun. Water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. Cholera is caused by bacteria. Right? All of these statements have a truth value, and their truth value happens to be true for all of them. Like if I added to this list that it is perfectly safe to drink Drano, that would have a truth value. It just would be false, like real false, everybody. But now over here, there's moral statements too that have truth values. Like polygamy is morally wrong, or genocide is morally wrong, or experimenting on prisoners is morally permissible. All of those are statements that you can say true or false to. And that's all it has to do is make sense. Polygamy is morally wrong. Or it is true that polygamy is morally wrong. It is false that polygamy is morally wrong. As long as that makes sense, that makes it a statement. That gives it a truth value. All of these qualify. So that's what they have in common with scientific statements. And in a minute, we're going to discuss how the perspective on the truth value of these can put you into one of two competing camps within ethics. So, thinking back to that chart, the scientific statements and the moral statements, which of those do you consider objective facts, and which of them do you consider values or subjective, right? So many people will say, well, the scientific ones are obviously objective, they're facts, and the moral statements are subjective, they're a kind of opinion fact type things, right? But not everybody says that. Not everybody thinks that, by the way. And so the answer you give puts you into one of two camps, meaning the answer you give to the question of let me rephrase that. If you think that moral statements are strictly subjective value expressions from individual people, hence opinions, you're going to be in one camp. But if you think that moral statements, when properly argued, can have an objective quality to them, or at least many of them can be objective, they're not just opinions, they are universal, that puts you in another camp, namely the relativists versus the universalists. Now, for the relativists, there's a couple of theories. Ethical subjectivism is one. We'll talk about this next week. And cultural relativism is another. We'll talk about that in the next discussion. And then there are universalists. So these people say, hey, those moral statements you made, no matter what they were about, polygamy, genocide, theft, whatever the case might be, they are relative. It's relative to who said them or what culture said them. There's no real ultimate universal truth to any of those statements at any time. That would be the relativist camp of ethics. The universalist camp, which includes religion-based, ethical egoism, altruism, utilitarianism, deontological theorists, rights-based theorists, virtue ethicists. These are amongst others, these are universalist moral theories. They're not saying that morality or moral statements are all a matter of opinion. They're saying many moral statements have universal validity, should apply to everyone at all times. And that's not something that you can just look out into the world and point at. You have to argue for those claims, and argue they will. And we'll look at many of these in turn, and the arguments for these different positions in turn. And there's some crossover. They're not fully exclusive. As a matter of fact, it's better to view them in the end as somewhat complementary, but they wouldn't say so as they argue for them. We'll see. But hopefully that gives you a good, some scope as to what we're going to be looking at in this course. And so for the first half of the course, we'll be doing ethical theory. And then we will start looking at applied ethics, or those ethical issues, those issues that make you itch, that kind of seem, like should there be a death penalty or not? Should we pursue human genetic enhancement or not? Should all recreational drugs be legal or not? Environmental ethics. So then we'll be, in the second half of the course, we'll be taking a look at those more everyday practical issues. But what's needed first is a good grounding in theory. And care ethics. And again, our course is out of those metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics.